Welcome back. Selamat kembali, everyone. We truly hope that you had a pleasant lunch break and valuable networking conversations. Now, let us continue the afternoon session with our next panel of experts who will share their perspectives on strategies to maximize and safeguard the value and trust in research. With that, join me to welcome our moderator, Caroline Sutton, CEO, International Association of Science, Technology, and Medical Publishers. Please welcome.
Thank you so much. And let me just pull up my notes here. Good morning, or excuse me, good afternoon, everyone. As was mentioned, my name is Caroline Sutton, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this session on open research, strategies to maximize and safeguard the value and trust in research. And a special thank you to Taylor and Francis for sponsoring this session and for inviting me to chair such an excellent panel this afternoon. In just a moment, I will introduce you to our panelists, but first, just let me share a bit of information on the structure of our session so you know what to expect. So after introductions, I just want to set the stage around this topic and the topics that we'd like to discuss this afternoon. And then each of our panelists will give a short introduction to their own thoughts in this area. And then we're hoping that we'll have a bit of a free-flowing conversation as well as we have some prepared questions. We also hope that we'll have some time to allow you in the audience to use the microphones and to stand up and share your thoughts, your reactions, or any questions you might have that you'd like to pose to the panelists. So, on that, let me introduce you to the individuals here joining me on the stage. And like many of the speakers from this morning's sessions, these individuals wear more than one hat. That is, they are involved in many different arenas. And I think that's going to give them a real breadth of experience that will shape the comments and conversation we have this afternoon. So first, I'd like to introduce Professor Abi Veerkumarasavam, who is well known to many here at the summit. He is a geneticist, an educator, and a science communicator. And before taking on his current role as the provost at Sunway University, he was the dean of the School of Medical and Life Sciences. And I also just want to mention, among many other things that he's involved with, he currently chairs the International Network for Government Science Advice in Asia, which aims to support the use of scientific evidence in informing policy at all levels of government, and many other things that you can read about in our program. We're also joined on the far end by Dr. Suzanne Rentsov-Vasu, who is the regional project director for the European Commission-funded Euraxis Worldwide Network. Euraxis facilitates interdisciplinary scientific collaboration and researcher mobility between Europe and the world. And Suzanne also has background from working with the European Commission and policymakers in Europe. She's based in Singapore and will bring a lot of her background to this conversation. And then finally, in the middle, is Liz Allen, who is Director of Strategic Initiatives at F1000, which is a part of the Taylor and Francis Group, a publisher. She's involved in shaping new initiatives and partnerships to promote and foster open access and open research publishing. But prior to F1000, she also spent time on the evaluation team at the Wellcome Trust. And alongside this, she serves on a number of different boards in the research and publishing sector. So, on that, let me just set the stage before I invite our speakers to come up and make some introductory remarks. So, as I mentioned, I am the CEO of the Global Association for Scholarly Publishers, STM. And just to give you some background, the members of STM come from 25 different countries on different continents. Together, they publish somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% of all of the English language articles, journals, as well as tens of thousands of monographs each year. And I had to jump at the chance to join this discussion this afternoon because our mission is to advance trusted research. And I think that that's something that many of you as university leaders also share in that type of a mission. And we're doing that through 4 areas of activity. We are working to advance open research. We are advancing research integrity, social responsibility, and then developing standards and collaborative technology to allow us to drive our activities in these areas. And I just want to share one thing that we have built, which I think helps to set some of the stage for our conversation today. We have developed a dashboard, an OA dashboard, that provides an interactive space for exploring data around the uptake of open access publishing globally. And I just want to share that what we see is that in 2022, 35% of all research, review, and conference papers were published gold open access. So that is that the version of record had been made available to everyone. Here in Malaysia, since we're in Malaysia, I'd like to also share with you that in 2022, Malaysia was actually above this global average at 41% of all research articles being published open access, and 46% of research outputs behind a subscription paywall, so only being published in a subscription journal. So what I want to say is I think that as we see this trend, because we see this trend across the globe with open access publishing taking off, subscription dipping, that we're starting to come towards a tipping point. And so I think it really is also a time when we're thinking about what does this mean? Because alongside thinking about open access to research articles, we're now talking much more about open research and open science. That is, how do we work with researchers to open up the entire research life cycle, encouraging the sharing of research data, methods, and many other practices to kind of break open the inputs as well as outputs of the research process. And so these conversations about how to transition from the university side have typically involved the library. And of course, librarians typically look at that through the lens of a limited budget, and budgets that are often shrinking. And so I really want to applaud the QS organizers for recognizing that this is a topic that really needs to be discussed at a higher level where we can see the broader picture so that we can really talk about what are the potentially enormous rewards as well as the costs of making this shift. How do we maximize those benefits, and how do we minimize the challenges and potentially negative consequences? So these are big questions, so I will warn you that I don't think we will ultimately solve this over the next 50 minutes or so, but I do think that my panel today will provide some inspiration and some food for thought. And so with that, I would like to hand the microphone over to Professor Abi for his first thoughts on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline, for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. As my two esteemed co-panelists today will speak on the theme from a publisher's perspective, as well as from a policy and principles framework angle, I thought that I would share my views through a lens of a researcher. As researchers, I believe that we can agree that the normative ideal that in performing research, science must be transparent, science must be open, and scientists should be held accountable. The production of scientific knowledge is a highly collective and cumulative process, and thus the transparency and openness is extremely critical to ensure that the tentative discoveries that we make and publish in the journals withstand the robust scrutiny and test of time before it's accepted as scientific knowledge. Researchers rely on trust. One, to trust other researchers' work. And two, for others to trust your work. No single person has the time or the talent, well, at least I don't have it, to become an expert in all scientific fields. And therefore, everyone must have that level of trust in the scientific findings that we read, so that scientists or the scientific community as a whole can progress, especially more so when we speak about interdisciplinary approaches to solutions. But when we talk about normative ideals, do they really operate in the current post-normal times? If at normal times we had confidence in our facts and values, and we could take our time in making the correct and appropriate decisions, in post-normal times that's characterized by chaos, there appears to be a sense of urgency. and the future feels like we are always on a constant chase into the unknown. So does open science improve our trust and value in science? As researchers, the answer is probably yes. But how are research articles published in low-impact, open science journal evaluated as compared to a high-impact journal with limited open science practices? Do we automatically trust papers that are more highly cited than those that are not, even if we understand the prevailing gamification of citations? So what do we trust? And as an author and as a reader, what do we value? And what about the public? Some recent publications suggest that open science, as a statement of commitment to openness and transparency, appears to be improving public trust in science. But this is the same public that we are deeply concerned because they are increasingly isolated in their own echo chambers, susceptible to their own confirmatory biases, and are unable to discern the robustness and validity of the available data deluge. This is the same public that we are concerned either perpetuate or are victims of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation that is grappling democracies all over the world. What more in a world where there are facts, but there are also alternative facts. There are reality, and there's my perceived reality. We are all experts. So even if trust across all levels of society is higher because of open access, what about the integrity of our research ecosystem? Many scientific institutions and institutions of higher learning ecosystems have been rocked by scandals involving research misconduct and also questionable research practices. And a number of studies have examined the scale of the reproducibility failures, even if there are no accusation of misconduct, and the opaque mechanisms of how institutions manage these cases, and the limitations of code of conduct and legal regulatory frameworks perhaps requires us to think about or perhaps have sufficient introspection at an individual level. The need to create or nurture a culture of responsible conduct of research that extends beyond mitigating misconduct and questionable research practices, but what about the realization of the social responsibilities of science? What do we value? What is our impact? Various bibliometric analyses have characterized the explosion of research articles on the SDGs over the last 5 years. And it's really great that many organizations have now embraced sustainability as a core mission within their business enterprise. And this is independent of their motivation. It is a move in the right place, in the right way. But how many papers actually translate to effective policy makings? How many research discoveries and innovations that are published and patented translate to become the solutions that they promise to be? Malaysia, thanks to the efforts of the Academy of Sciences of Malaysia and led by Professor Nur Saada of University of Malaya, has now recently established the Malaysian Open Science Platform to help mainstream open science and data sharing in Malaysia. But how do we incentivize scientists and institutions to use and contribute towards the platform? How do we also prepare a new generation of researchers to be able to leverage on this great resource? And perhaps even think beyond the boundaries of our ivory towers. So for example, leveraging on the citizen science movement so that we can maximize the potential of the available data. Moving towards a whole nation approach towards scientific inquiry, discovery, and dissemination. And I suppose that is why Tunku Ali reminded us of our roles as institutions of higher learning. And because organizations such as QS have huge influence in modifying our behavior and practice. So how might we ensure that our rating measures and priorities are calibrated beyond the scope of what perhaps some people will say, the fallacy of objectivity, to a more robust and holistic approach that focuses on actual tangible or intangible value and impact? If anything, the world we live is going to be completely more open. We are going to be more conscious of what we individually value, and we are going to be a lot more exposed. So we need to ensure that our call for openness is more than a euphemistic label or a business opportunity. And for this, we need a whole ecosystem approach in which it starts with the individual researcher, the organization in which he or she operates, and a national or global research ecosystem that incentivizes positive trust building, robust ethical dialogue, values-driven ecosystem and impact, and the creation of trusted networks through platforms like this that we have today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation to speak, and it's always a pleasure to come after Abi because he sets the bar really, really high, and I think he's already raised a lot of food for thought for us. Now, I'd like to come in and draw from my experience as an engagement specialist, as someone who is very much involved in facilitating scientific collaboration between the research communities here in Southeast Asia with their counterparts in the European research area, particularly in the framework of a funding program, the EU's framework program for research and innovation called Horizon Europe, which perhaps you know is the world's largest international collaborative research and innovation program that invites stakeholders from the public and the private sector. Now, this program is very much based on the idea of international collaboration, is firmly anchored on the principle of openness, inviting participation from stakeholders across the world, but is also committed to the policy principle of open science. So the European Commission has really adopted open science as the modus operandi when it comes to implementing this international funding program. Now, what does that mean? That means that any beneficiary of Horizon Europe grants is mandated, is required to make research data and any research output that comes out of this funded project accessible in open science. So the principle that is applied here to this policy priority is to be as open as possible and as closed as necessary, of course, having to strike the right balance between the researchers' right to their intellectual property while allowing them to comply with the obligation for open access, which means really to make science and data and output findable. It needs to be accessible, it needs to be interoperable, and it needs to be reusable by default. So what the funding body here has done is to not make this a choice, but to make it mandatory. Now, why, of course, is a funding body like the Commission doing this? And I think the benefits that arise from adopting open science as a policy principle are really to create, and Abi's already alluded to that, to create an environment of transparency. Not only an environment of transparency, but also to widen, I think, the circle of stakeholders in the scientific process, which by default then makes the scientific evaluation process more robust and in turn creates support for the integrity of research. I think what is important to emphasize, and that plays into what Abi has said as well, is that the mandatory sharing of research data and research output really provides entry points for stakeholders in the scientific process that would perhaps not necessarily be the primary recipients of research data that is put out, but really to create a very diverse group of scientific stakeholders who each bring to the table new ideas, who kind of pollinate each other, that allow science to create new collaborations beyond the traditional silos, beyond also borders, and really allows for science to be a lot more responsive also to the challenges that the world is facing today, which are all transnational in nature. So really just to summarize, so what the Commission as a funding body is doing is to promote open sharing of research data and research output through the FAIR principle. And I think most importantly, through the adoption of open science as a policy priority, it involves non-traditional players in the scientific process. Citizen science here is the key word, which I think creates for more diversity, it creates more creativity, and it eventually strengthens the science trust in the scientific process. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to follow Susanna and Abby with a publisher perspective on open science. And publishers are very much part of the whole ecosystem around making research output available and usable and disseminated and able to build kind of metrics and indicators around. So publishers are very much part of this connected ecosystem that both Abby and Susanna talked about. So I just wanted to reflect on open science more generally. Lots of people talk about the definition and the words of open science and open research. They're very interchangeable, but actually there's lots of kind of agreement around the framework of what open science is about and what it can deliver. And Susanna talked about the European Commission's kind of definition and framework for open science, but perhaps the one that is used most globally is the UNESCO definition of open science, of which this is the document and the reference source too. And it also summarizes really what open science is about, basically making the whole process of science more inclusive and transparent and democratic. That's one of the key underpinning principles of the UNESCO guidelines. But really what it's actually about is making sure that the research that we do is valuable to society, it delivers economic and social development and benefits to all. But there's lots bound up in that. And it's a collective system, a collective research system that we all work within. And one of the most important things to think about in doing research is to make research discoverable. And publishers are kind of key, absolutely key in that role of making research discoverable in the first place. And it was mentioned quite a lot this morning around making sure that research, there's lots of connections and discoverability around research, so you can find it, you can understand where its provenance is from, and you can trust it. And this is something that publishers particularly are really focusing on at the moment in terms of making that work discoverable, accessible, in ways that we know that we can trust it. So some of the things that publishers are doing, and some of these are very much aligned with what a lot of the work that universities and institutions are doing also, and funding agencies. One of the key things that publishers have a role in is making sure that the research is actually available in the first place. So it's discoverable through providing open access publishing, providing lots of metadata links so you understand where the research is. The second area, and again, all of these are emphasized in the UNESCO guidelines, making sure that there are ways for different audiences to engage and understand the context and usability of that research. So enabling ways for researchers and different kinds of audiences, from policymakers to researchers to the publics to different audiences for research, to make sure that there's ways for them to engage in that content and use that content, but most importantly, find that content. And then coming back to the aims of our discussion today, also a really important role for publishers is to build mechanisms to maximize trust and discoverability in that research. So including things like persistent identifiers, and this is something that universities also have a role in doing, and research funders and institutions themselves, to build in mechanisms to allow you to connect research to all the different outputs and researchers to all those outputs as well, which helps you be able to validate where the content's from and trust and find the provenance of that work. So something that's really important, and it's a really fundamental thing, is that to make work discoverable, you need to put identifiers, you need to build in metadata to allow that work to be, first of all, discoverable, understandable, described in ways that other people can use it. And there are a number of examples of persistent identifiers and things that publishers and institutions and funders are using on the slide there. Goes back to what Susanna was saying. Unless you have these fundamentally built into the system, you can't make research fair. You can't make it findable, accessible, interoperable, or reproducible. So they're almost a fundamental foundation block that we could all work towards. And the second big issue why these things are really, really important is to help build increased trust and understanding the provenance of research, to make sure that when you find that research, you know it's usable, you know you can trust it to use it. There are lots of kind of issues emerging all over the world, driven by some positive and some negative factors. There's some examples here, and again, it was talked about this morning around the use of AI and new ways of producing research. Some have very positive benefits, others we have to be careful with. But this also, for publishers, means that there's a real important acceleration of the need for us to improve and enhance the way that we build in trust markers in the research. So again, kinds of metrics and information around how trusted is that research, how much can we use that research, how ready is that research for us to use. So basically building in measures and markers and information that allows us to know that the research that we're publishing and sharing has integrity that others can build upon. So I just wanted to summarize before we go to a broader discussion. Publishers have a key role to play in making open science practices possible, and this is something that's being encouraged across lots of universities and through lots of open science guidelines. There's basically a really important need to improve validation processes and trust in research, so making sure that we have trust markers across the research life cycle through all aspects of the research system. And then to go back again to what Abby said, one of the really important things here is that this is a whole system way of working. We need to work as a whole system. Metrics, research institutions, individual researchers, publishers, funders, we're all part of a connected ecosystem. We all need to make sure that what we're incentivizing and what we're driving, we understand the impacts of, we understand the unintended consequences of, but we do it in the way that we're trying to achieve the goals of open science. And some of those goals need to be very carefully systematized, and we all need to work together and collaborate on to make those successful. So I'll stop there and hand over to Caroline to bring in the discussion. Can you hear me? Thumbs up? No, you can't hear me. Now we can hear me. Yes, excellent. Okay. Thank you to all of our panelists for those introductory remarks. I'd like to have a little bit of a discussion. I'd like to delve a little bit deeper into some of the points that you've already raised. And I wanted to start with impact, because if I were someone in the audience and I'm a leader at a university, I'm really thinking, as from what I heard from some of the topics this morning, how am I, through my university, really driving real-world impact, be that educating tomorrow's labor force? How are we addressing some of the really important issues that are facing the world today. And we've mentioned that open science helps with transparency, it's inclusive, it's democratic. I'm wondering if we can think about, but what does that look like in practice? What does impact look like in practice as the result of open science? What is really, truly kind of the vision for that, if I might? Abby, could I start with you?
Sure. Thanks. Can you hear me, right? Okay, yeah. So I think yeah, you're right in saying this, because I think impact can be both tangible and intangible, right? So I think tangible is something that you can see and you can certainly measure, but then there's that intangibility. So I'm going to focus more on the tangible aspects of this. And I think impact is about, at least in the context of research and science, we always ask ourselves, why do we research? And it always starts from an ideation. But where does that idea come from? It comes from a very defined problem statement. And of course, in research, there are three categories. You have one that's fundamental research, where the research really, you don't actually have a particular application in place at this moment, but you just have a particular phenomenon that you want to answer. But a lot of the work that we actually talk about impact falls in the other two categories, the applied-based research and the experimental development research, where that research is actually meant to solve a problem that is affecting a certain key stakeholder. This key stakeholder could be government, it could be within a particular society or certain community, or it could be an industry-based problem. And so if you talk about impact, is how much of your work has actually taken you closer to a solution. And so one of the things that we actually are doing at Sunway University, and we're very proud of our collaboration with Lancaster University, is because the question of research, right? So yeah, sure, we play the research game, we are very proud of our citations and whatever it is. But when it actually comes to impact and what defines our university, it would be actually how do we uplift the communities that live around us. So at Sunway, just a few minutes away, there's a community called the Mentari Court that actually really suffers from various different inequalities and equities. In Lancaster, they also have the same problem in Morecambe Bay. And they've got a project called the Eden Project. And so for us, this open research is extremely critical. How can we actually share the practices in Southeast Asia and the practices in Northwest England, and actually to look and see what are the commonalities and to support each other in driving that palpable impact in both these communities.
Thank you. Suzanne, I wonder if you, from a funder perspective and thinking about you've been working with the funder community and obviously with the project with Your Access, really thinking about what are the outputs of that and open access being a key. What are some tangible outputs you'd like to see that truly result directly from things having been opened as opposed to closed?
I think what Abhi said is really the key. It's kind of breaking down silos through open science. It's moving away from these very closed corridors in a way where research data and output just remains accessible only for a select group, and moving it kind of into the open. And for us, I think for a funder, it's always important to see how this open science, the sharing of knowledge, the sharing of data allows for collaboration beyond the traditional, international collaboration, but also intersectoral collaboration, as I said, like bringing in stakeholders into the scientific process that you wouldn't necessarily have. And something traditional, just a university collaborating with industry to find tangible solutions for very concrete problems that we're facing. So I think that is really the impact, really communicating this beyond and creating opportunities beyond the traditional kind of channels of science and communication.
Want to jump back in?
Yeah, if I don't mind just adding, I think one of the biggest impediments in our scientific process is actually the hubris of researchers and scientists, where we know that we have got the ability and resources and skills to answer questions. But I think sometimes we perhaps don't realize that the best questions may not be coming from us. And so a lot of times we think of open science as an opportunity to share data. But actually open science, and I like the way you talked about citizen science and the work, it's actually the ideation process too. Why, we really should think about that access to that data should be actually opened to the industry, to the society, so that when we think about ideation, that ideation has to be co-created from T0 with these stakeholders in place.
Yeah.
Because otherwise the solutions will never be accessible, and I think a lot of us have patents that are not licensable or solutions which is totally not culturally acceptable.
Yeah, thank you. So I'd like to shift to recognizing there will be impact, and so this is truly what we're trying to achieve. But we've got to ensure, of course, that researchers themselves are able and well positioned in order to adopt these practices. And I think this is a real cultural shift. And so my next question, and what I'd like to explore a little bit, is what skills, we talked a little bit about the job market and what skills we need, but what skills do we need moving forward as a researcher, and whether the types of skills are going to need to support researchers in the universities in these practices, becoming open scientists, open scholars. I'd like to just begin with you, Liz, because I know working with F1000, as a publisher, we're introducing policies sometimes to move researchers to actually do open science, and that's where we sometimes meet with, no, I don't want to do this. And so I'm just wondering if you have some observations to kick off our conversation on this.
Yeah. I actually think there's a lot of challenges with open science in that there's a cost associated with implementing some of the policies that are required from funding agencies, from publishers, to make your research data available, to publish open access. There's lots of cost and time associated with that for the researchers. So some of the key things I think that will help bridge the gap between coming up with policies and actual practical implementation involves training and support for researchers. So there needs to be investment in helping the policies become real, because otherwise there's a lot of waste in that system, developing policies that can't be implemented or are problematic or add extra burden to researchers and institutions in supporting them. So it needs to be a whole system focus for activity and support and training. So starting at the most basic things, training around how to make your data available in a way that is useful to others, in a place that others can access and find it. So going back to my metadata push, making sure that you can find this. There's no point creating your data and putting it somewhere that no one understands what you've shared or how to use it. That's just a waste in many ways, including the environmental waste of storing what data that's not going to be used. So there's a whole load of information and work needs to be done to support training around that. And those are things that universities can work with funders and policymakers to actually help support, and publishers too. But it is an ecosystem thing for me. Training is really, really key, and we certainly don't want to add burden onto researchers who are already pushed doing many things.
Yeah. And Avi, as someone who's in the academy and as a geneticist, you will have been one of the fields that was beginning to share data at an early stage. I'm just wondering, one, are there some lessons you think that your field has learned that might help others? But equally, do you foresee new types of training or how this might shape, let's say, master's and PhD programs going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, at least from a genetic standpoint, you're right. So with the Genome Project, with all the different huge amounts of data, right, which they already mandated this from 20 years ago that you need to upload it. But the problem has always been annotation. So a lot of data, but people can't really use it. Yeah. So you technically have complied with the regulations, but you have not quite actually served the larger purpose. And I think that lesson has been learned, and I think one of the things that, at least in Malaysia, the Open Science Platform has learned from the other countries where we've actually worked closely with libraries. So I agree with Liz that we cannot put everything on researchers and the research ecosystem. I think working with other support systems to actually set the framework. But coming towards education, I think there are two parts to this. One is skills. And I think realizing that it's no longer about generating data, but actually leveraging on existing data. And I think that's really also one of the big problems, right?
Yeah.
Because so you get a lot of countries that perhaps will embrace open data. But are those countries also able to leverage and use that data? Or is open data now going to be a source for other more prepared countries to actually use it and perhaps then broaden that equity divide? So for me, the first thing that we have to focus on is actually to get more and more researchers to be a lot more data savvy, more individuals to be data savvy, because data is now going to be used not just for PhD type research, it's to every life decision, every business decision. So for us, making sure data savviness is important. But data alone is not the only thing. We talked about that impact, that stakeholders. So I think, it sounds cliche, but the soft skill of communication, the humility that you don't have the answers and you are codependent. And I think part of our education, really tries to get people to emancipate, to be self-sufficient. But actually, in a world in which we talk of post-normal times, where there's so much chaos, what's actually telling you is that you don't have all the answers. And so part of the problem that you see generations feeling that, you call them strawberry generations, they are not resilient. Why is that? It's because they are still trying to find within them that actually they don't have all the answers and they need to coexist. So there's also a need for, education, and that's what we do at Sunway, and I know many universities are doing now, which is to ensure that it doesn't matter what you're studying. Every student has to be involved in community service. Every student has to be involved in, understanding what does integrity mean beyond their professional responsibilities. What is that greater purpose they must serve? Because I think that is that one gap that they need to have. Because skills alone, you can have all the best data savviness, but if you don't serve that bigger purpose, that gap is going to, if anything, grow.
Thank you. Suzanne, I wonder if I might also turn to you on this topic, because I know that the European Commission, in addition to issuing policies, has also put funding into developing programs to help support researchers to adopt these practices. I don't know if this is some of the area that you've been working with, or if you are able to answer about that, but I'm wondering if there were anything in particular that you think was particularly successful and useful in Europe that others might learn from in terms of helping to train and develop the skills of researchers to adopt open research practices?
The European Commission has set aside specific funding under its funding program to train early career researchers. It's the Mir Skłodowska Career Actions Program, and that integrates into this funding program open science. It's an integral part into really prepare, as Abi said, the next generation of researchers to really be savvy about data sharing and becoming fluent in open science. But I think also, besides echoing what the colleagues have just said, I think it also requires kind of a mind shift amongst the leadership, because I think a lot of researchers do want to comply with open science. They want to share their data. They even perhaps have access to platforms where they can do that, but there's, I think, often lacking the right signal also from the management that says this is the right thing to do. Maybe that also leads us to the issue of assessment, which is another kind of big box that needs to be unpacked, because I think these two go hand in hand. Without, I think, the signal from those people that are in charge of your career path, researchers themselves will be hesitant to go down the path of sharing their data and collaborating, yeah.
Thank you. That was actually the next sort of set of topics I thought we might start to dig into, is precisely not just assessment, but what are those incentives? Because we are asking researchers to change their behaviors. Change is painful. I'm in my own habits, doing things as I've always done them. Now someone's asking me to do this a different way. And second of all, some of this is a bit burdensome. I'm being asked to take additional steps. Before I could just keep my data on my computer, and in my day it was handwritten notes that were up in an attic. But now we're asking them to take additional steps. And also not even that, but to think about, if someone else finds my data, what are they going to need in order to be able to interpret that? And that is a big step. So how do we, on the one hand, provide incentives for folks to actually take those steps, but two, how do we also reduce that burden? And we started talking a little bit about that, needing some of the other infrastructure to help do that job for researchers to reduce that burden. Abi, do you have any thoughts on incentives?
Yeah.
And assessment might also be a part of that solution, right?
Yeah. So I think we also have to go, we have to be very careful, because I think there's actually a fine balance between incentivizing and then over-incentivizing, and also what is it that we are actually incentivizing for. And I think this is really, I like the way, Suzanne mentioned, it's not just knowledge and skills, it's also values and mindset. I think if researchers actually understand that if everyone practices what they're doing, then they will actually benefit from it. And you have seen that through various different things that we do. Health and safety is an example. So I think it's really important that as leaders of organizations, we make it very clear what is the value to them so that there is an instant gratification for them, but then also for that ecosystem that will then feed back into them itself. But this is where I think when you talk about incentives, we have to focus on intangibles. And I think one thing that universities generally fail to do is because we tend to rely on objective quality measures. How many papers you publish? What percentage was your student feedback for the year? How many papers did you publish? What citations? And these are the measures that are normally used when you are promoting people. And one area that we don't is that intangible performances. And I think one thing that we really need to do more of an effort and to hack through is a simple word called citizenship. And citizenship can actually extend beyond institutions, but also in citizenship as a Malaysian or a citizen of the world. Having that effort for leaders at the department level, at the school level, and at the university level to be able to characterize those and to make that part of their performance, I think that will automatically calibrate human behavior.
Thank you. And let's also, though, dig a little bit into research assessment, because what I find very interesting is I have an opportunity to speak with funders and institutions and researchers around the world, and that is one of the topics. As soon as you start talking open science, we start talking about reward systems and the need to really rethink the current assessment of research. And I wonder if, Suzanne, you might kick us off, because you raised that topic as well, of what are some of the ways in which we need to rethink research assessment at our current juncture in order to promote and recognize open research?
I think it's basically what Abi is alluding to, that you cannot see yourself as an individual anymore. I mean, science is inherently a collaborative effort. Knowledge is only acquired if people work together. And I think the assessment has to move away from just the individual achievements and has to put a lot more emphasis on the collaborative effort of it. So how are you collaborating with others? How are you communicating what you're doing to kind of not your traditional audience, just the people in your specific thematic field, but really a wider audience? How are you integrating the public, citizen science into your research, and how are you letting others benefit from the work that you do? And exactly as Abi said, how is your work benefiting society at large? I think this is how assessment needs to be reformed.
Thank you. And Liz, I know that you had a past life working and thinking as a funder about assessment, and now being a publisher. Where does the publisher community support research assessment? And I know that some of the critique in the early days of open access was in particular around impact factor and the misuse of the impact factor. But yeah, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this, please.
I think some of the major challenges in being able to incentivize some of the more intangible things is how to do that effectively without huge burdensome on the people doing the research assessment, as well as the individuals supplying the information for the research assessment. Because it's easier to measure something where there's something quantitative, and that's what's happened in the past. We've focused on things we can measure, and there's an amazing quote from Einstein saying something to that effect. Somebody else quoted Einstein this morning. I can't remember the quote, but essentially everything that's quantitative isn't always the important thing. The challenge is, I think a lot of publishers have been able to produce metrics based around publishing patterns, publishing behaviors, citations, things like that. And some of those things are really important to show that science is being shared and used by others. So we're not taking everything away. But there aren't infrastructures and metric systems and ways to effectively capture a lot of the other softer things that are really important for citizen science and for science citizenship. So that's where we need to do better, and that's where I guess organizations like QS, it would be great, as was mentioned this morning, if we can have more softer measures built into those kinds of frameworks too, because the more they're built together, the better you have complementary qualitative, quantitative information together. But in the absence of some of those things, the easy way and the perhaps lazy way is to just focus on what you can measure, which is, I mean, there's Goodhart's law as well, is as soon as you put a measure out there, people will strive to the measure and it will cease to be a good measure anymore. That happens all the time, but we need alternatives, and we need practical alternatives that are effective for universities to manage and anyone else doing research assessment. So again, it's a system-wide thing, and its impact is not an easy nut to crack, but we've got to try harder.
Yeah, thank you. Did you have a final comment on that, Abby?
Yeah, I just want to add, and I think a lot of times we think of incentives also because we also look at a very specific timeline, right? But I think all of us are here today because we represent our institutions of higher learning. And the reality is that, you know, the institutions that exist currently with our current measures and our current relevance may no longer exist in the next few decades. If we continue to perpetuate some of these instant self-gratifying measures, what we are doing is actually just continuously making us less and less relevant to the quadruple helix, be it the government, the policymakers, the industry, and the society. And I think we really need to, and that's why I really like what you just said, we really need to think about not just these current measures, but also how do these measures in the end are seen by researchers, because in the end, or seen by society or industry. And I think the faster we start measuring our impact, not based on what we can measure and what other people feel instead, it's very critical towards relevance of institutional higher learning now and for the future.
Thank you. I do want to just ask in the audience if anyone has any questions or comments or thoughts. Please, there are microphones in the hallway, so please, I see someone up front here who had a question. Excellent. And there are a couple of microphones in the middle and in the next aisle as well, if anyone else would like to come up.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity, Caroline. My name is Badri Munir Skoco from Universitas Erlangga and currently represented Indonesian Higher Education Ministry of Education, Culture and Research and Technology from Indonesia. Caroline and all of the speakers, I think this afternoon's discussion is quite interesting. I do believe that ranking institutions accelerated academic research and publication in the last 2 decades. Before and after ranking institutions established, I think it's quite tremendous. And also either globally, regionally, or nationally. And open science, open research, and open access. And research available to everyone, free of charge. We expect that it can advance our society in a better way. But at the same time, actually, open access, I try to focus on open access, try to move the money from readers to scientists.
Yeah.
When the money from reader to scientists, and then the R&R, review and process on scientist side, become loose. And then, of course, we are the witness of mushrooming predatory journals and publishers and questionable journals and every term that you can find, I think. And my question and also suggestion is what kind of consensus or what kind of protocols that ranking institutions as the most influential institution try to direct this open access and open science, open research initiative in order to overcome the drawback of this phenomena. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone like to address that?
Yeah, I think part of that question was around some of the questionable practices around open access publishing, and that's a really important issue, which I think a lot of publishers are now starting to deal with, which was my point about research integrity. It's really important that where researchers are publishing open access and having to pay to publish, which is a challenge in itself, especially in resource-poor environments, that they publish in a place that is bona fide and that does have validation checks and does have proper metadata applied. But it's a real minefield, but it's really important that researchers really focus on finding places to publish that do have the proper infrastructures in place, that are bona fide publishers and that aren't predatory. But we do know that there's a world where lots of people are now publishing open access in places in valid journals, problematic journals that really do not count for your career in any way, stretch or form. So that's a real big issue for open science. That's kind of an unintended consequence of some of the push towards open science, is that there are spurious practices have emerged in publishing that are exploiting some of the that bad ability to behave like that. But yeah, it's a big issue, but it is important that researchers are supported in being directed and being supported in where they publish, that it is a place that is, validated and checked and properly peer-reviewed and all that kind of stuff.
Please, but I think the colleague actually had another question regarding the cost of publication.
Yeah.
Where...
May I?
Yeah, sure, please go ahead, yeah.
May I try to make it straightforward?
Yeah, sure.
What kind of stick and carrot that ranking institution can apply so that it can
It's on the rankings.
have a better society, I think. Without ranking institutions, consensus, and also protocols, as well as us as academicians, I think the problem will be not solved, I think.
Do you want to?
I think I understood your question to be just very straightforward about if we were to think about this in terms of rankings,
Yes.
what would our advice be? And I think that's a good question to round off this panel, given that we are here with the QS Summit. Perhaps we might have you also either comment or add to that, and then we'll get back to that. I'll round them into.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, it was something I was just briefly discussing with Barry earlier, but it's a question that's kind of, I suppose, preoccupying me at the moment is, we're all trying to come to terms with the new kind of AI apps. Now, at the moment, if you ask an AI app to provide you with a literature review on a particular topic, it'll be blighted by two things. One is it will contain a whole bunch of fake information from these various kind of open access fake journals, predatory publishers. And second, it won't have access to anything behind a paywall, so to a lot of the journal articles and the resources. Now, what I'm wondering is what you've been talking about. If we produce better metadata, which enable AI to distinguish genuine papers and genuine results from bogus ones, and if we move everything into an AI kind of platform, into an open access platform, presumably this will mean that AI apps will be able to produce literature reviews very rapidly and very high quality. And I'm just wondering where that leaves us as researchers, as the historic arbiters of what knowledge counts and what doesn't count and how to assemble it. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Thank you. And I recognize that our time has run out, so let me just say two things. One, I realize those were two very different questions. So I think I just want to quickly ask, was there any comment on the rankings? And Abby, you might be best positioned to comment on that.
Yeah, so I think the comment by Liz about the fact that there needs to be a lot more soft and contextual measures rather than hard data that's easily gamified and sometimes maybe perversely shifting the purpose of research would be the way forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then I'll just make a very brief comment on yours, and I'd love to talk to you later at the dinner, because STM is actually doing a lot of work in trying to dig into some of precisely those questions, because what we also find is that the AI engines are actually using some of the illegal sources of that content, and some of that may well have been retracted. And so we have a concern about, we want, if there is going to be AI tools, they should be doing that search on the trusted content that is being curated. And it should be tagged, and we're also doing some work to think about how might we tag that better also in this world. So let's have a further conversation about that, and I'm sorry that we've run out of time, but I want to thank all of my panelists here, as I'm sure you would as well, and so I'll just say thank you, and then we will shuffle off for the next group. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very